Hello everybody, it is May 31st, 2025 here in the United States of America. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about something that's been on my mind for quite some time, something that I had intended to make a video about, and something that I wish to elaborate on further in the future. Now, initially I was going to talk about one of three events happening in the world currently in the realm of geopolitics, and that is the negotiations between the United States and Iran over its nuclear program, which are ongoing. The negotiations between Hamas, the United States, and Israel over the Gaza war, which are ongoing, and the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia and what's happening in that war in general. Now there is going to be a meeting between a Russian and Ukrainian delegation to attempt to negotiate some kind of end to this war taking place in Istanbul on June 2nd. So I want to wait and see how those events, play out before I make any videos on them, because frankly nothing has happened yet that I haven't covered or already spoken about. So I would like to wait to see what happens in regards to those things before I talk about them anymore, because frankly I just feel like I'm repeating myself. But in today's video I'd like to talk about the way the world could actually achieve some kind of lasting peace. And by lasting peace, generally probably a few decades. Lasting peace generally doesn't last any longer than that before some kind of new paradigm takes shape and the world enters yet another conflict. But for the time being, major conflicts could be avoided. Now, as many are aware, we are entering a new paradigm where we are transitioning from a unipolar world dominated by the United States of America into a multipolar world, where instead of one hegemonic world power, we now seem to be entering an era of multiple world powers asserting their influence and dominance in their own particular spheres of influence. Those three main world powers are the United States. Yes, the United States, due to some very bad internal mismanagement and poor foreign policy decisions, is losing its role as the dominant unipolar world power, but make no mistake, the United States is still an extremely formidable power and will remain one of the three main world powers going forward. That being said, the three main world powers are the United States, China, and Russia, generally in that order. Economically and militarily, I'd say the United States and China are pretty close to being not quite tied, but the United States is still, I would say, a bit ahead of China in some areas, not by much. Russia is in third place. It has a smaller population than both nations, and I think is a little behind in industrial capacity, and also isn't nearly as powerful economically. But Russia also does have the most experienced and battle-tested military out of the three, and it's the only one that's fought a peer-to-peer, high-intensity war in the last 50 or 60 years. Make no mistake, the Russian military, despite casualties and material losses it has suffered, is, I think, at this point, probably the world's most potent and tested fighting force. And Russia also has the most abundant natural resources, and I would say the greatest, I don't want to say the most potential out of the three, but it definitely has the potential to be close to being tied for number one with the United States and China. That might be a ways off, but it is firmly in third place out of the three powers and ahead of most other world powers. India, I would say, is a close fourth place, but India also has some pretty serious internal issues that I think prevent it from really being a major world power, at least now. So what I think should happen is take the UN out of the equation. I think the UN is essentially useless. Take the European Union out of the equation. They're too dysfunctional to ever be some kind of superpower. Not to go off on a tangent about the European Union, but one of the problems was the European project, as it's ran now by bureaucrats and neoliberals, does not respect the national sovereignty of its member states. It has caused quite a bit of animosity towards itself especially nations like Poland and Hungary, nations that wish to assert their own sovereignty within the European Union because they think the European Union is not being run in a way that respects their national sovereignty. The European Union, if run by the right people and more competent, pragmatic people, could have been a superpower, essentially, made up of a confederation or federation of European states that largely retained their sovereignty and voluntarily were part of a union that overall respected the sovereignty of each individual nation state and weren't trying to use them as some kind of template for this glorious future civilization that has completely open borders and is totally deindustrialized. So I think the European Union shot itself in the foot there. So they are not going to be one of the major world powers. Now, individually, France and Germany are still somewhat powerful as regional powers, but they don't have the capacity that they used to. So take the UN out of the equation, take the European Union out of the equation. What needs to happen is there needs to be a three-way summit between the United States, China, and Russia to figure out what each nation's red lines are, what each nation's national security concerns are, what each nation's economic interests are, what their spheres of influence should be, where those spheres of influence end and another begins, and what steps need to be taken to ensure that each of these sovereign nations does not feel like it is going to enter into direct conflict with the other. Now, the way the world currently works and is going to work moving forward, at least for the next few decades, is that the world is going to be dominated politically, economically, and culturally by these three powers. Chiefly, the Western Hemisphere is going to be, especially North and South America, is going to continue to be dominated by the United States of America. Eastern Europe and Central Asia is going to be dominated by Russia, and East Asia is going to be dominated by China. And those three regions of the world are each one of these countries' respective spheres of influence. And if we wish to avoid a third world war, then these three respective nations need to sit down and work out some kind of treaty, some kind of agreement between the three that prevents direct conflict or proxy conflicts between the three powers. Now, what's happening right now between Ukraine and Russia is a proxy conflict between, yes, the United States and the collective West in general, which is led by the United States, make no mistake about that, and Russia, to prevent Russia from ascending to the place where it could be a great world power. This is about hurting Russia militarily and economically to keep Russia in its place so that Russia cannot interfere in any kind of future conflict between the United States and China or assert itself in the world and put a stop to this global neoliberal project that has been floundering now for quite a few years and is an abject failure. The entire reason for this conflict is that now the cultural, political issues between the Ukrainians and the Russians were something that was taken advantage of by the West to further this conflict and turn it into what it is now. But again, this is a war that's meant to weaken Russia, to move it from third place further down the ladder so it could be dealt with easier or even broken up. That's just the truth. That's the brutal, pragmatic reality of it. Now, do I think this was a good idea? No, it clearly hasn't been a good idea. The plan didn't succeed. And it's only furthered turning the world from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. So, in effect, it actually gave those running the foreign policy of the United States and the West in general exactly what they were trying to avoid in the first place. Any major world war that does happen will be fought between these three powers, and if war is to be avoided, then I think a realization needs to happen that subterfuge and sabotage and trying to destroy each other is going to lead to the very conflict and result that everyone is trying to avoid in the first place. So there needs to be some kind of understanding between the United States, Russia, and China so that we could coexist in a way that prevents wide-scale death and destruction. Now, the United States, Russia, and China can absolutely be competitors. Now, I'm sure espionage will still happen. There'll be economic competition, flexing militarily on each other. But again, like, there needs to be some kind of agreement in the Pacific between where China's sphere of influence begins and the United States' sphere of influence begins. Now, where does the United States tolerate the ending of its sphere of influence? And what is China's policy moving forward in regards to Taiwan? That issue definitely would need to be resolved. Now, between the United States and Russia, these issues within Eastern Europe and NATO being up against Russia's borders, that is something that absolutely does need to be resolved. And then the United States, though, out of the three world powers, is the only one that seems to not have any of its borders or interests, directly on its border off its coast threatened because of the geographic location of the United States. This is essentially on an island fortress right in the middle of North America with two weak neighbors and two massive oceans between it and every other world power. So it has the most strategically advantageous geographic position of the three, which is why I think the United States generally has been less careful in its foreign policy and will probably have this tendency to be less careful in its foreign policy moving forward, and also attempt to be the dominant of the three world powers and assert itself a bit more over the other two than China or Russia would be willing to assert themselves over the United States. So again, that's an attitude that would need to be addressed. It's something that would need to be worked out. But if we are going to have lasting peace moving forward and some kind of way to prevent widespread death and destruction, because keep in mind, nuclear weapons are very abundant. We're much less careful than we were in the Cold War about getting into some kind of nuclear conflict. And I think the only way to avoid this is a direct summit between the three powers where they sit down. Well, first of all, the meeting needs to be headed by political pragmatists and realists, not neocons from the United States, not hardliners from Russia, and certainly not hardliners from China. This needs to be people willing to sit down and acknowledge objective reality, the objective reality that exists between the three nations currently today, economically and militarily. To take a look at the three issues, or the main issues affecting these three powers, and actually be willing to talk about them and compromise on them if need be. That's what needs to happen. The UN, I think, is a toothless joke. It always has been. It doesn't really serve any purpose. Every time there's some kind of issue, UN member states will, like the war in Gaza, for example. Plenty of UN member states have voiced their opinion, saying that how Israel is conducting itself in the war in Gaza has been abysmal. They have been very, very reckless in regards to civilian casualties. Okay, great. The UN says that, then what? Nothing happens. Nothing happens. So the UN, again, has no real collective power. The people, the countries determining what events take place in this world are the three most influential countries: the United States, Russia, and China. They have by far the most power economically and militarily. They're able to influence their neighbors. They're able to coerce their neighbors, if need be, into making certain political decisions. They're able to leverage countries around them in a way that the UN can't. So again, if there is to be some kind of lasting world peace, there needs to be an understanding between these three powers that yes, it's these three powers that are going to dominate the world moving forward. That reality isn't going to change. So there needs to be some kind of summit and understanding between the three if this is how things are going to work out for at least the next few decades. But anyways, I would like to elaborate more on that in the future. That's just kind of sums up my idea on the whole thing. Obviously, there need to be some pretty complex treaties between the three countries. Very long, arduous negotiations happening between the three. It wouldn't be something that could be solved or dealt with overnight, but I think that would be the way to handle things moving forward. And if I was a U.S. diplomat or in the upper levels of the U.S. government, that is absolutely something that I would be advocating for with Russia and China. But anyways, I'll be back Wednesday with another video, and I hope everyone out there has a great day.